Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to what I hope will be an enjoyable series to many people, although it may be of niche interest. Specifically, this series is transcribing the audiobooks of Douglas Adams' The Hitch-hiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Life, the Universe and Everything, and So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, as read by Stephen Moore. Stephen Moore, for those who don't know, is the actor who played Marvin the Paranoid Android on the original radio production of The Hitch-hiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the TV series which followed soon after. This is the genuine Marvin the Paranoid Android, except no substitutes. When the radio series first aired in 1979, I was about 5 years old, and it was then repeated multiple times over several years on Radio 4, where it was first broadcast. My father was an avid fan of Hitch-hikers as soon as it was produced, had the books, which I still have copies of, and listened to the radio series repeatedly, as did I growing up, to the point where I think I overtook my father in terms of my fandom for the series and would insist that we listen to it whenever it was on a Saturday, usually around about lunchtime, and it just had to be on in the background so I could listen to it. Later, in school, having consumed the radio series multiple times and the books, I discovered the audiobooks in the school library, as read by Stephen Moore. And of course, I got these out and listened to them repeatedly as long as I could. Obviously, I had to take them back. They were, after all, library books on tape. Recently, I got to thinking about these books on tape and how enjoyable they were. Being read by Stephen Moore, it had the voice of Marvin the Paranoid Android whenever he read the Marvin lines, and of course, the correct voice for the other characters that he also read in the radio series. And simply as the narrator, he has an excellent reading voice. So I remembered how much I enjoyed those as a child and then thought, I wonder if they're still readily available. As it turns out, they are not. They have never been produced on DVD or online. They only exist in that original tape form, and those tapes themselves are incredibly hard to find, as I discovered as I attempted to dig them out online from various shops and sources. I have now got all but one of the books, and hopefully by the time I get to the last book that Stephen Moore read, I should have all the tapes available. I would like to stress, I do not own the copyright for these tapes. I do not own the copyright for the original material, and I'm recording them in these videos in an effort to preserve them because they are on magnetic tape. Magnetic tape degrades, and there aren't very many of them left around as far as I can see, and there's been no effort to reproduce these professionally in another format, either online, digitally, or even just on CD. So if you do own the copyright for these, please, by all means, copyright claim these videos as the material is your own, but I would request humbly that you do not block them, just monetize them. My channel isn't monetized, so I'm not going to make money from this anyway, but I would like people, future generations, to be able to access these amazing recordings and enjoy Stephen Moore's work long into the future. Anyway, enough about my motivations for doing this, and now here is Life, the Universe and Everything, Cassette Side 1.
The regular early morning yell of horror was the sound of Arthur Dent waking up and suddenly remembering where he was. It wasn't just that the cave was cold. It wasn't just that it was damp and smelly. It was the fact that the cave was in the middle of Islington and there wasn't a bus due for 2 million years. Time is the worst place, so to speak, to get lost in, as Arthur Dent could testify, having been lost in both time and space a good deal. At least being lost in space kept you busy. He was stranded in prehistoric Earth as the result of a complex sequence of events which had involved him being alternately blown up and insulted in more bizarre regions of the galaxy than he had ever dreamt existed. And though life had now turned very, very, very quiet, he was still feeling jumpy. He hadn't been blown up now for 5 years. Since he had hardly seen anyone since he and Ford Prefect had parted company 4 years previously, he hadn't been insulted in all that time either, except just once. It had happened on a spring evening about 2 years previously. He was returning to his cave just a little after dusk when he became aware of lights flashing eerily through the clouds. He turned and stared, with hope suddenly clambering through his heart. Rescue! Escape! The castaway's impossible dream, a ship. And as he watched, as he stared in wonder and excitement, a long silver ship descended through the warm evening air, quietly, without fuss, its long legs unlocking in a smooth ballet of technology. It alighted gently on the ground, and what little hum it had generated died away as if lulled by the evening calm. A ramp extended itself. Light streamed out. A tall figure appeared silhouetted in the hatchway. It walked down the ramp and stood in front of Arthur.
"You're a jerk, Dent."
It was alien. Very alien. It had a peculiar alien tallness, a peculiar alien flattened head, peculiar slitty little alien eyes, extravagantly draped golden robes with a peculiar alien collar design, and pale, grey-green alien skin, which had about it that lustrous sheen which most grey-green faces can only acquire with plenty of exercise and very expensive soap. Arthur boggled at it. He was feeling the effects of having not said anything to anybody for as long as he could remember. The alien creature frowned briefly and consulted what appeared to be some species of clipboard which he was holding in his thin and spindly alien hand.
"Arthur Dent. Arthur Philip Dent."
Yes,
"You're a jerk. A complete asshole."
The creature nodded to itself, made a peculiar alien tick on its clipboard, and turned briskly back towards its ship. Said Arthur desperately.
Don't give me that."
It marched up the ramp, through the hatchway, and disappeared into its ship. Hey! Shouted Arthur, and started to run helplessly towards it. "Wait a minute! What is this? What? Wait a minute! Come back here and say that!" He jumped and danced until his legs trembled, and shouted till his lungs rasped. There was no answer from anyone. There was no one to hear him or speak to him. The alien ship was already thundering towards the upper reaches of the atmosphere. Its occupant, the alien with the expensive complexion, leaned back in its single seat. His name was Wowbagger the Infinitely Prolonged, one of the universe's very small number of immortal beings. Those who are born immortal instinctively know how to cope with it, but Wowbagger was not one of them. Indeed, he had come to hate them, the load of serene bastards. To begin with, it was fun. He had a ball, living dangerously, taking risks, cleaning up on high-yield long-term investments, and just generally outliving the hell out of everybody. In the end, it was the Sunday afternoons he couldn't cope with, and that terrible listlessness which starts to set in about 2:55 when you know that you've had all the baths you can usefully have that day, and that as you stare at the clock, the hands will move relentlessly on to 4 o'clock, and you will enter the long, dark tea-time of the soul. So things began to pall for him. The merry smiles he used to wear at other people's funerals began to fade. He began to despise the universe in general, and everybody in it in particular. This was the point at which he conceived his purpose, the thing which would drive him on, and which, as far as he could see, would drive him on forever. It was this. He would insult the universe. That is, he would insult everybody in it, individually, personally, one by one, and, this was the thing he really decided to grit his teeth over, in alphabetical order. The ship fled on through the night. Meanwhile, on Earth, it began to pour with rain, and Arthur Dent sat in his cave and had one of the most truly rotten evenings of his entire life, thinking of things he could have said to the alien, and swatting flies, who also had a rotten evening. The next day he made himself a pouch out of rabbit skin, because he thought it would be useful to keep things in. This morning, 2 years later than that, was sweet and fragrant as he emerged from the cave he called home. Though his throat was sore again from his early morning yell of horror, he was suddenly in a terrifically good mood. He wrapped his dilapidated dressing-gown tightly around him and beamed at the bright morning. He had just had a wonderful idea about how to cope with a terribly lonely isolation. He beamed again, and took a bite out of a rabbit leg left over from his supper. He chewed happily for a few moments, and then decided formally to announce his decision. To add weight to his words, he stuck the rabbit bone in his hair. He spread his arms out wide. "I will go mad," he announced. "Good idea," said Ford Prefect, clambering down from the rock on which he had been sitting. Arthur's brain somersaulted. His jaw did press-ups. "I went mad for a while," said Ford. "Did me no end of good." Arthur's eyes did cartwheels. "You see," said Ford. "Where have you been?" interrupted Arthur, now that his head had finished working out. "Around and about." "I went to Africa," said Ford. "And this is your cave, is it?" Yes, said Arthur. He felt very strange. After nearly 4 years of total isolation, he was so pleased and relieved to see Ford that he could almost cry. Ford was, on the other hand, an almost immediately annoying person. Very nice, said Ford, in reference to Arthur's cave. You must hate it. Arthur didn't bother to reply. Africa was very interesting, said Ford. I behaved very oddly there, but I won't disturb you with the details because they would— What? Disturb you? But you may be interested to know that I am single-handedly responsible for the evolved shape of the animal you came to know in later centuries as a giraffe, and I tried to learn to fly. Do you believe me? Well, tell me. I'll tell you later. I'll just mention what the guide says. The guide. The Hitch-hiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you remember? Yes, I remember throwing it in the river. Yes, said Ford, but I fished it out. The guide says that there is an art to flying, said Ford, or rather a knack. The knack lies in learning how to throw yourself at the ground and miss. He smiled weakly. He pointed at the knees of his trousers and held his arms up to show the elbows. They were all torn and worn through. I haven't done very well so far, he said. He stuck out his hand. I'm very glad to see you again, Arthur, he added. Arthur shook his head in a sudden access of emotion and bewilderment. I haven't seen anyone for years. Not anyone. I can hardly even remember how to speak. I keep forgetting words. I practice, you see. I practice by talking to... What are those things people think you're mad if you talk to? We're surrounded by them, for heaven's sake. I've planted hundreds myself. They all died. Trees! I practice by talking to trees. What's that for? Ford still had his hand stuck out. Shake, prompted Ford. Arthur did, nervously at first, as if it might turn out to be a fish. Then he grasped it vigorously with both hands in an overwhelming flood of relief. He shook it and shook it. After a while, Ford found it necessary to disengage. They climbed to the top of a nearby outcrop of rock and surveyed the scene around them. What happened to the Gulgafrinchans? Asked Ford. A lot of them didn't make it through the winter 3 years ago, and the few who remained in the spring said they needed a holiday and set off on a raft. History says that they must have survived. Huh, said Ford. Well, well. Suddenly, there was about Ford a sense of energy and purpose. We're going, he said excitedly, and shivered with energy. Where? How? I don't know, said Ford, but I just feel that the time is right. Things are going to happen. We're on our way. I have detected disturbances in the wash. The wash? The space-time wash. Are we talking about some sort of Vogon laundromat, or what are we talking about? Eddies, said Ford, in the space-time continuum. Ah, is he? What? Said Ford. Who is Eddie, then, exactly, then? Ford looked angrily at him. Will you listen? I have been listening, said Arthur, but I'm not sure it's helped. Ford grasped him by the lapels of his dressing gown and spoke to him as slowly and distinctly and patiently as if he were somebody from a telephone company accounts department. There seem to be some pools of instability in the fabric of space-time. Ah, that, said Arthur. Yes, that. They stood there alone on a hill on prehistoric Earth and stared each other resolutely in the face. Arthur, hello, yes? Just believe everything I tell you, and it will all be very, very simple. Ah, well, I'm not sure I believe that. They sat down and composed their thoughts. Ford got out his sub-ether sensomatic. It was making vague humming noises, and a tiny light on it was flickering faintly. Flat battery? No, said Ford. There is a moving disturbance in the fabric of space-time, an eddy, a pool of instability, and it's somewhere in our vicinity. Where? There, said Ford, shooting out his arm. There, behind that sofa. Arthur looked. Much to his surprise, there was a velvet, paisley-covered Chesterfield sofa in the field in front of them. He boggled intelligently at it. Shrewd questions sprang into his mind. Why is there a sofa in that field? I told you, shouted Ford, leaping to his feet. Eddies in the space-time continuum. And this is his sofa, is it? Arthur, shouted Ford at him, that sofa is there because of the space-time instability I've been trying to get your terminally softened brain to get to grips with. It's been washed up out of the continuum. It's space-time jetsam. It doesn't matter what it is, we've got to catch it. It's our only way out of here. Catch it, muttered Arthur, then frowned in bemusement as he saw that the Chesterfield was lazily bobbing and wafting away across the grass. With a whoop of utterly unexpected delight, he leapt down the rock and plunged off in hectic pursuit of Ford Prefect and the irrational piece of furniture. They careered wildly through the grass, leaping, laughing, shouting instructions to each other to head the thing off this way or that way. Ford and Arthur pounded chaotically after it, but it dodged and weaved as if following its own complex mathematical topography, which it was. Still, they pursued, and suddenly they were practically on top of it. With a heave and a shout, they leapt on it. The sun winked out. They fell through a sickening nothingness and emerged unexpectedly in the middle of the pitch at Lord's Cricket Ground, St. John's Wood, London, towards the end of the last test match of the Australian series in the year 1980-something, with England needing only 28 runs to win.
Important facts from Galactic History number 1. Reproduced from the Sidereal Daily Mentioner's Book of Popular Galactic History. The night sky over the planet Cricket is the least interesting sight in the entire universe.
It was a charming and delightful day at Lord's, as Ford and Arthur tumbled haphazardly out of a space-time anomaly and hit the immaculate turf rather hard. The applause of the crowd was tremendous. It wasn't for them, but instinctively they bowed anyway, which was fortunate because the small red heavy ball which the crowd actually had been applauding whistled mere millimetres over Arthur's head. In the crowd, a man collapsed. "What was that?" hissed Arthur. "Something red," hissed Ford back at him. "Where are we?" Somewhere green." "Shapes," muttered Arthur. "I need shapes." "This your sofa?" said a voice. "What was that?" whispered Ford. Arthur looked up. "Something blue," he said. "Shape?" said Ford. Arthur looked again. "It is shaped like a policeman." "Come on, you two. Let's be having you." These words had an electrifying effect on Arthur. He leapt to his feet like an author hearing the phone ring, and shot a series of startled glances at the panorama around him, which had suddenly settled down into something of quite terrifying ordinariness. "Where did you get this from?" he yelled at the policeman's shape. "What did you say?" "This is Lord's Cricket Ground, isn't it?" snapped Arthur. "Where did you find it? How did you get it here?" "I think that I had better calm down." He squatted down abruptly in front of Ford. "It is a policeman," he said. Having said this, he sauntered off towards the edge of the pitch, brushing down his dressing-gown. He then noticed his dressing-gown and stopped. He stared at it. He flung himself at the policeman. "So where did I get these clothes from?" He collapsed and lay twitching on the grass. Ford shook his head. "He's had a bad 2,000,000 years," he said to the policeman, and together they heaved Arthur onto the sofa and carried him off the pitch, and were only briefly hampered by the sudden disappearance of the sofa on the way. Reactions to all this from the crowd were many and various. Most of them couldn't cope with watching it, and listened to it on the radio instead. "Well, this is an interesting incident, Brian. I don't think there have been any mysterious materializations on the pitch since... I don't think there have been any, have there, that I recall. Edgbaston, 1932? Ah, no, what happened then? Well, Peter, I think it was Cantor facing Wilcox coming up to bowl from the pavilion end when a spectator suddenly ran straight across the pitch. Yes, there's nothing actually very mysterious about that, is there? He didn't actually materialize, did he? He just ran on. And for those of you who've just tuned in, you may be interested to know that two men, two rather scruffily attired men, and indeed a sofa, a Chesterfield, I think, yes, a Chesterfield, have just materialized here in the middle of Lord's Cricket Ground. But I don't think they meant any harm. They've been very good-natured about it, and Sorry, can I interrupt you a moment, Peter, and say that the sofa has just vanished? So it has. Well, that's one mystery less. Still, it's definitely one for the record books, I think, particularly occurring at this dramatic moment in play. England now needing only 24 runs to win the series. The men are leaving the pitch in the company of a police officer, and I think everyone's settling down now, and play is about to resume.
Now, sir, perhaps you'd care to tell me who you are, where you come from, and what that little scene was all about.
Ford looked at the ground for a moment as if steadying himself for something. Then he straightened up and aimed a look at the policeman which hit him with the full force of every inch of the 6 light-years distance between Earth and Ford's home near Beetlejuice. "All right," said Ford, very quietly. "I'll tell you." "Yes, well, that won't be necessary," said the policeman hurriedly. "Just don't let whatever it was happen again." The policeman turned round and wandered off in search of anyone who wasn't from Beetlejuice. Fortunately, the ground was full of them. Arthur sat up. "Where am I?" "Lord's cricket ground," said Ford. "Fine." 10 minutes later, hunched over a cup of tea in the refreshment tent, the colour started to come back to his haggard face. "How are you feeling?" said Ford. "I'm home. Home. It's England. It's today. The nightmare is over. I'm where I belong." "There are 2 things I feel I should tell you," said Ford, tossing a copy of The Guardian over the table at him. "One is," he said, pointing at the date at the top of the paper, "that the earth will be demolished in 2 days' time." "I'm home. Tea, cricket, mown grass, wooden benches, white linen jackets, beer cans." Slowly, he began to focus on the newspaper. "I've seen that one before." His eyes wandered slowly up to the date which Ford was idly tapping at. "And the other thing," said Ford, "is that you appear to have a bone in your beard." Arthur was shaking. "Perhaps I should—" "No," said Ford sharply. "What?" "Don't try and phone yourself up at home." "But why not?" said Arthur. "Look," said Ford. He picked up an imaginary phone and dialed an imaginary dial. "Hello? Is that Arthur Dent? Ah, hello, yes. This is Arthur Dent speaking. Don't hang up." He hung up, he said, shrugged, and put the imaginary phone neatly back on its imaginary hook. A glummer look replaced the already glum look on Arthur Dent's face. "So, we're not home and dry." "We could not even be said," replied Ford, "to be home and vigorously toweling ourselves off." The game continued. The bowler approached the wicket at a lope, a trot, and then a run. He suddenly exploded in a flurry of arms and legs, out of which flew a ball. The batsman swung and thwacked it behind him over the sight screens. Ford's eyes followed the trajectory of the ball and jogged momentarily. He stiffened. He looked along the flight path of the ball again, and his eyes twitched again. "This isn't my towel," said Arthur, who was rummaging in his rabbit-skin bag. "Shh," said Ford. "I had a Golga Frinchen jogging towel," continued Arthur. "It was blue with yellow stars on it. This isn't it." "This one's pink," said Arthur. "It isn't yours, is it?" "I would like you to shut up about your towel," said Ford. Ford was beginning to behave rather strangely. Regardless of the bemused stares it was provoking from his fellow members of the crowd gathered round the pitch, he was waving his hands in sharp movements across his face, ducking down behind some people, leaping up behind others, then standing still and blinking a lot. After a moment or two of this, he started to stalk forward slowly and stealthily, wearing a puzzled frown of concentration. "This isn't my bag either," said Arthur suddenly. Ford's spell of concentration was broken. He turned angrily on Arthur. "I wasn't talking about my towel," said Arthur. "We've established that that isn't mine. It's just that the bag into which I was putting the towel, which is not mine, is also not mine, though it is extraordinarily similar. Now, personally, I think that that is extremely odd, especially as the bag was one I made myself on prehistoric Earth. These are also not my stones," he added, pulling a few flat grey stones out of the bag. "I was making a collection of interesting stones, and these are clearly very dull ones." A roar of excitement thrilled through the crowd and obliterated whatever it was that Ford said in reply to this piece of information. The cricket ball, which had excited this reaction, fell out of the sky and dropped neatly into Arthur's mysterious rabbit-skin bag. "Now, I would say that that was also a very curious event," said Arthur, rapidly closing the bag and pretending to look for the ball on the ground. Play resumed with a new ball. The sun continued to shine, and Ford continued to jump up and down, shaking his head and blinking. "Something's on your mind, isn't it?" said Arthur. "I think," said Ford, "that there's an SEP over there." "A what?" "An SEP. An SEP," he said, "is something that we can't see or don't see or our brain doesn't let us see because we think that it's somebody else's problem. That's what SEP means. Somebody else's problem. The brain just edits it out. It's like a blind spot. If you look at it directly, you won't see it unless you know precisely what it is. Your only hope is to catch it by surprise out of the corner of your eye." "Ah," said Arthur, "then that's why you've been jumping up and down and blinking and... I think you've got the message." "I can see it," said Arthur. "It's a spaceship." For a moment Arthur was stunned by the reaction this revelation provoked. A roar erupted from the crowd, and from every direction people were running, shouting, yelling, tumbling over each other in a tumult of confusion. He stumbled back in astonishment and glanced fearfully around. Then he glanced around again in even greater astonishment. "Exciting, isn't it?" The apparition wobbled in front of Arthur's eyes. "I think your team have just won. You are English, aren't you?" "Yes," said Arthur. "Well, your team, as I say, have just won the match. It means they retain the Ashes. You must be very pleased. I must say I'm rather fond of cricket, though I wouldn't like anyone outside this planet to hear me saying that. Oh, dear, no. Still, it'll all be over in a couple of days, won't it? Though, as I said to you when we last met, I was very sorry about that. Still, whatever will have been, will have been." Arthur tried to speak, but gave up the unequal struggle. He prodded Ford again. "I thought something terrible had happened," said Ford, "but it's just the end of the game. We ought to get out. Oh, hello, Slarty Bartfast, what are you doing here?" "Oh, pottering. "That your ship? Can you give us a lift anywhere?" Patience. "Hello, Slarty Bartfast," said Arthur at last. "Hello, Earthman." The old man stared keenly onto the pitch, with eyes which seemed alive with expressions that had no apparent bearing on what was happening out there. What was happening was that the crowd was gathering itself into a wide circle round the centre of the pitch. What Slarty Bartfast saw in it, he alone knew. All that seemed to be afoot was a ceremony of some kind. It was being specially staged for the benefit of TV rather than the spectators, and all they could gather about it, from where they were standing, was what they heard from a nearby radio. Ford was aggressively uninterested. He fretted as he heard it explained that the Ashes were about to be presented to the captain of the English team out there on the pitch, fumed when told that this was because they had now won them for the nth time, positively barked with annoyance at the information that the Ashes were the remains of a cricket stump. And when, further to this, he was asked to contend with the fact that the cricket stump in question had been burnt in Melbourne, Australia in 1882, to signify the death of English cricket, he rounded on Slarty Bartfast, took a deep breath, but didn't have a chance to say anything because the old man wasn't there. He was marching out onto the pitch with terrible purpose in his gait. His hair, beard, and robes swept behind him, looking very much as Moses would have looked if Sinai had been a well-cut lawn instead of, as it is more usually represented, a fiery, smoking mountain. "He said to meet him at his ship," said Arthur. "What in the name of Zarking Fardwarks is the old fool doing?" exploded Ford. "Meeting us at his ship in 2 minutes," said Arthur, with a shrug which indicated total abdication of thought. They started off towards it. Strange sounds reached their ears. They tried not to listen, but could not help noticing that Slarty Bartfast was querulously demanding that he be given the silver urn containing the Ashes, as they were, he said, vitally important for the past, present, and future safety of the galaxy, and that this was causing wild hilarity. They resolved to ignore it. What happened next they could not ignore. With a noise like 100,000 people saying "whop" A steely white spaceship suddenly seemed to create itself out of nothing in the air directly above the cricket pitch and hung there with infinite menace and a slight hum. Then it opened up and let something quite extraordinary come out of it. 11 robots. White robots. What was most extraordinary about them was that they appeared to have come dressed for the occasion. Not only were they white, but they carried what appeared to be cricket bats. And not only that, but they also carried what appeared to be cricket balls. And not only that, but they wore white ribbing pads round the lower parts of their legs. These last were extraordinary because they appeared to contain jets which allowed these curiously civilized robots to fly down from their hovering spaceship and start to kill people, which is what they did. "Hello," said Arthur. "Something seems to be happening." "Get to the ship," shouted Ford. "I don't want to know, just get to the ship." He started to run. "I don't want to know, I don't want to see, I don't want to hear," he yelled as he ran. "This is not my planet. I didn't choose to be here. I don't want to get involved. Just get me out of here and get me to a party with people I can relate to." Smoke and flame billowed from the pitch. "Well, this supernatural brigade certainly seems to be out in force here today," burbled a radio happily to itself. "What I need," shouted Ford, "is a strong drink and a peer group." He continued to run, pausing only for a moment to grab Arthur's arm and drag him along with him. "They're playing cricket," muttered Arthur, stumbling along after Ford. "I swear they are playing cricket. They're not just killing people, they're sending them up. Ford, they're sending us up." It would have been hard to disbelieve this without knowing a great deal more galactic history than Arthur had so far managed to pick up in his travels. The ghostly but violent shapes that could be seen moving within the thick pall of smoke seemed to be performing a series of bizarre parodies of batting strokes, the difference being that every ball they struck with their bats exploded wherever it landed. The very first one of these had dispelled Arthur's initial reaction that the whole thing might just be a publicity stunt by Australian margarine manufacturers. And then as suddenly as it had all started, it was over. The 11 white robots ascended through the seething cloud in a tight formation, and with a few last flashes of flame entered the bowels of their hovering white ship, which, with the noise of 100,000 people saying "Whoop!" promptly vanished into the thin air out of which it had whopped. For a moment there was a terrible, stunned silence, and then, out of the drifting smoke, emerged the pale figure of Slarty Bartfast, looking even more like Moses, because in spite of the continued absence of the mountain, he was at least now striding across a fiery and smoking, well-mown lawn. He stared wildly about him until he saw the hurrying figures of Arthur Dent and Ford Prefect forcing their way through the frightened crowd, which was for the moment busy stampeding in the opposite direction. Slarty Bartfast was gesticulating urgently at Ford and Arthur and shouting at them as the three of them gradually converged on his ship, still parked behind the sight screens and still apparently unnoticed by the crowd stampeding past it. "They've gobble, wobble, fobble." "What did he say?" panted Ford as he elbowed his way onwards. "They've table, wobble, fobble." "It sounds urgent," said Arthur. "They've gobble, wobble, the ashes." "He says," said Arthur, "that they've taken the ashes. The burnt remains of a cricket stump. It's a trophy. That is apparently what they have come and taken." "Strange thing to want to tell us," snapped Ford. "Strange thing to take." "Strange ship." They had arrived at it. The second strangest thing about the ship was watching the somebody else's problem field at work. They could now clearly see the ship for what it was simply because they knew it was there. It was quite apparent, however, that nobody else could. The most extraordinary thing about it was that it looked only partly like a spaceship, with guidance fins, rocket engines, and escape hatches and so on, and a great deal like a small, upended Italian bistro. Ford and Arthur gazed up at it with wonderment and deeply offended sensibilities. "Yes, I know, but there is a reason. Come, we must go. The ancient nightmare is come again. Doom confronts us all. We must leave at once." Ford and Arthur followed Slarty Bartfast into the ship, and were so perplexed by what they saw inside it that they were totally unaware of what happened next outside. A spaceship, yet another one, but this one sleek and silver, descended from the sky onto the pitch, quietly, without fuss, its long legs unlocking in a smooth ballet of technology. It landed gently. It extended a short ramp. A tall, grey-green figure marched briskly out and approached the small knot of people who were gathered in the centre of the pitch, tending to the casualties of the recent bizarre massacre. It moved people aside with quiet, understated authority, and came at last to a man lying in a desperate pool of blood, clearly now beyond the reach of any earthly medicine, breathing, coughing his last. The figure knelt down quietly beside him.
Arthur Philip Deodat.
The man, with horrified confusion in his eyes, nodded feebly.
You're a no-good, Dumbo, nothing. I thought you should know that before you went.
Important facts from Galactic History number 2. Reproduced from the Sidereal Daily Mentioner's Book of Popular Galactic History. Since this galaxy began, vast civilizations have risen and fallen, risen and fallen, risen and fallen so often that it's quite tempting to think that life in the galaxy must be A. Something akin to seasick, space-sick, time-sick, history-sick, or some such thing, and B. Stupid.
It seemed to Arthur as if the whole sky suddenly just stood aside and let them through. It seemed to him that the atoms of his brain and the atoms of the cosmos were streaming through each other. What happened?
We took off,
said Slartibartfast. And he stared for a moment at the wide panoramic screen in front of him, which displayed a bewildering complexity of stars streaming like silver threads around them. The interior of the flight deck was dark green, dark red, dark brown, cramped and moodily lit. Inexplicably, the resemblance to a small Italian bistro had failed to end at the hatchway. How far did we just travel?
About 2/3 of the way across the galactic disk, I would say, roughly.
Where are we going? Said Ford.
We are going to confront an ancient nightmare of the universe.
And where are you going to drop us off?
I will need your help.
Tough. Look, there's somewhere you can take us where we can have fun. I'm trying to think of it. We can get drunk and maybe listen to some extremely evil music.
A curse has arisen from the mists of time. A curse which will engulf the galaxy in fire and destruction and possibly bring the universe to a premature doom. I mean it. Doom! Come. There is much I must show and tell you.
He walked towards a green wrought-iron spiral staircase set incomprehensibly in the middle of the flight deck and started to ascend. Arthur, with a frown, followed. Ford stomped up the stairs behind them.
The central computational area is where every calculation affecting the ship in any way is performed. Yes, I know what it looks like, but it is in fact a complex four-dimensional topographical map of a series of highly complex mathematical functions.
It looks like a joke, said Arthur.
I know what it looks like,
said Slartibartfast, and went into it. It was a large glass cage, or box. In fact, a room. In it was a table, a long one. Around it were gathered about a dozen chairs of the bentwood style. On it was a tablecloth, and on the tablecloth sat some dozen half-eaten Italian meals, and toyed with listlessly by robots. It was all completely artificial. The robot customers were attended by a robot waiter, a robot wine waiter, and a robot maitre d'. And all participated in a little dance together, a complex routine involving the manipulation of menus, bill pads, wallets, checkbooks, credit cards, watches, pencils, and paper napkins, which seemed to be hovering constantly on the edge of violence, but never actually getting anywhere. Slartibartfast hurried in, and then appeared to pass the time of day quite idly with the maitre d', whilst one of the customer robots, an autorori, slid slowly under the table, mentioning what he intended to do to some guy over some girl. Slotty Bartfast took over the seat which had been thus vacated and passed a shrewd eye over the menu. The tempo of the routine round the table seemed somehow imperceptibly to quicken. Arguments broke out. People attempted to prove things on napkins. They waved fiercely at each other and attempted to examine each other's pieces of chicken. The waiter's hand began to move on the bill pad more quickly than a human hand could manage, and then more quickly than a human eye could follow. The pace accelerated. Soon, an extraordinary and insistent politeness overwhelmed the group, and seconds later it seemed that a moment of consensus was suddenly achieved. A new vibration thrilled through the ship. Slotty Bartfast emerged from the glass room.
Bistromatics, the most powerful computational force known to parascience. Come to the room of informational illusions.
He swept past and carried them bewildered in his wake. The bistromatic drive is a wonderful new method of crossing vast interstellar distances without all that dangerous mucking about with improbability factors. Bistromatics itself is simply a revolutionary new way of understanding the behavior of numbers. Just as Einstein observed that time was not an absolute, but depended on the observer's movement in space, and that space was not an absolute, but depended on the observer's movement in time, so it is now realized that numbers are not absolute, but depend on the observer's movement in restaurants. The first non-absolute number is the number of people for whom the table is reserved. This will vary during the course of the first 3 telephone calls to the restaurant, and then bear no apparent relation to the number of people who actually turn up. The second non-absolute number is the given time of arrival, which is now known to be one of the most bizarre of mathematical concepts. A reciproverse exclusion, a number whose existence can only be defined as being anything other than itself. In other words, the given time of arrival is the one moment of time at which it is impossible that any member of the party will arrive. The third and most mysterious piece of non-absoluteness of all lies in the relationship between the number of items on the bill, the cost of each item, the number of people at the table, and what they are each prepared to pay for. The baffling discrepancies which used to occur at this point remained uninvestigated for centuries simply because no one took them seriously. They were, at the time, put down to such things as politeness, rudeness, meanness, flashness, tiredness, emotionality, or the lateness of the hour, and completely forgotten about on the following morning. They were never tested under laboratory conditions, of course, because they never occurred in laboratories, not in reputable laboratories at least. And so, it was only with the advent of pocket computers that the startling truth became finally apparent. And it was this. Numbers written on restaurant bills within the confines of restaurants do not follow the same mathematical laws as numbers written on any other pieces of paper in any other parts of the universe. This single fact took the scientific world by storm. It completely revolutionized it. So many mathematical conferences got held in such good restaurants that many of the finest minds of a generation died of obesity and heart failure, and the science of maths was put back by years. Slowly, however, the implications of the idea began to be understood. To begin with, it had been too stark, too crazy, too much what the man in the street would have said, "Oh yes, I could have told you that about." Then some phrases like interactive subjectivity frameworks were invented, and everybody was able to relax and get on with it. The small group of monks who had taken up hanging around the major research institutes singing strange chants to the effect that the universe was only a figment of its own imagination were eventually given a street theatre grant and went away. The room of informational illusions was a welcome relief after the visual monstrosities of the central computational area. There was nothing in it. No information, no illusions, just themselves, white walls, and a few small instruments which looked as if they were meant to plug into something which Slotty Bartfast couldn't find. At that moment, he located the slot in the wall for which he had been searching and clicked the instrument he was holding into it.
Do not be alarmed. It's—"
They didn't hear what he said, because at that moment the ship winked out of existence around them, and a star battleship the size of a small Midlands industrial city plunged out of the sundered night towards them, star lasers ablaze.